Good evening, everyone, and welcome to SocialFlight Live. I'm Jeff Simon. We have a wonderful show for you this evening. SR-71 Reconnaissance Systems Officer Phil Soucy is here with us, and we're going to learn all about that aircraft, his background, and then we're going to talk a lot about the National Air and Space Museums, where he also spends time. So just a wonderful show. Before we get started, just a few things. First of all, SocialFlight's Fly to Win Challenge is right now just roaring. We are giving away a Lightspeed Zulu 3 headset on October 1st. We recently gave away an Aspen E5 electronic flight instrument. So we just keep giving things away, and you need to be in it to win it, as they say. So be sure to get the SocialFlight mobile app for Apple or Android devices. Just look for one word SocialFlight on the app or Google Play Store and download it. All you need to do is get that and then check in with the Fly to Win Challenge at your local airport. Even a single check-in gets you in order to be part of the drawing for that prize. If you check in at multiple airports and get more points and compete to be on the leaderboard, you get additional entries into that drawing. So tons and tons of cool things. And of course, SocialFlight.com allows us to support General Aviation by bringing you tens of thousands of aviation events, destinations, all sorts of cool things to get you out there and flying. That's our mission, that's our goal, and everything we can do to support that is wonderful. We appreciate it. We appreciate you spreading the word for that and supporting General Aviation as well. Tonight's broadcast is brought to us by Whip Air with the Whip Line floats that you can see on caravans and all sorts of different aircraft. But what a lot of people don't know is that at their South St. Paul Airport location, they also have a full services there of avionics and interior and paint and maintenance. They sell aircraft. Go check out their website at whipair.com. There is just so much going on there, and they are truly wonderful people, a family-owned business. I've been there, and if you ever get a chance to go there and tour, it's a wonderful opportunity to tour the factory and see what you've got going on there. It's very, very cool. Now, to tonight's program and our amazing guest. Phil Soucy is a graduate of the United States Air Force Test Pilot School at Edwards Air Force Base, and he served 20 years with the Air Force in a wide range of operational and technology positions. As a rated navigator, he has over 2,000 hours of flight experience in over 30 different aircraft, ranging from the F-4 Phantom to the amazing Mach 3 Plus SR-71 Blackbird. Following his time with the Air Force, Phil co-founded Modern Technology Solutions, an aerospace engineering services company. One of his most fascinating positions more recently is as a docent at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. He provides tours covering a wide range of aviation and space subjects to adults as well as student school groups. So if you're visiting one of these amazing museums, you may be one of the lucky ones to have Phil as your guide. Phil's also an active GA pilot and CFI with commercial, single, and multi-engine pilot certificates. I'm absolutely thrilled to have him here with me tonight to share some stories and give us some insight into one of the fastest aircraft to ever speed through the sky. I'm going to bring Phil on the line now. Please help me welcome to SocialFlight Live, Phil Soucy. How are you doing, Phil?
I'm doing great, Jeff. Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to see you again, and I truly appreciated spending time with you out at AirVenture this year and at the gathering. It was a great time with both myself and Jake and Ben, and was just so cool to be there. So big thanks to you and everything you do within General Aviation.
I enjoy it very much, and you're most welcome.
I'd like to kick things off with a little background of what brought you into the Air Force. So many people, especially even young people that are watching, love to understand what is it that brings some of these amazing people that come on the show, that gets them started, especially if that's with the armed forces. So tell me a little bit about how you landed with the Air Force and then how that translated into flying those amazing aircraft.
Yeah. So I didn't grow up in a family that was aviation oriented. In fact, I grew up in northern Vermont, the northeast part of Vermont there. Aviation there was some of it going on there, but there wasn't a huge airport nearby. We didn't take summer trips where we flew somewheres. You know, it was the family car going to visit relatives in maybe Connecticut or something like that. But when it was time to think about going to college, I graduated from high school in 1969, so the Vietnam War was going on. So I wanted to give some thought to, you know, what would be the best way to go as opposed to just throwing my name in the hat, or maybe not throwing my name in the hat, but getting drafted, right? That was another option. So what might be a better way to go as opposed to just leave it to fate? So I went to Norwich University, which is a private military school in Vermont. Wasn't too far from my home, about an hour and a half or so. Like I said, I hadn't really traveled that far, you know, outside of New England. I hadn't really gone anywhere. I had never flown, been on an airplane. And I went to Norwich, and you had to be an Army ROTC. It was a private military school, Corps cadets, that whole environment. And then between my sophomore and junior year, the Air Force came on campus, and that just changed my life. I was an engineer, mechanical engineering major, and when I considered what the options might be, being an engineer in the Army for some period of time, or being an engineer in the Air Force felt more appealing. And then there was this opportunity to maybe fly, and I initially started out on the path of wanting to be a pilot, desiring to be a pilot. But partway through I guess it was probably my junior year, you know, so I signed up with the Air Force, and probably between my junior and senior year, I was no longer able to pass the eyesight exam. And back then you had to be 20/20, and I started out being sort of borderline 20/20, but you know, as I got a few years into it, I no longer could pass the eye exam. But about that same time, we went to ROTC summer camp. You know, if you're an ROTC, usually between your junior and senior year, or maybe some branches between your sophomore and junior year, you go to summer camp for a month or so. And the summer camp that I went to was down in Florida. It was at Tyndall Air Force Base. I'd never flown on an airplane. They gave me a ticket, a commercial airline. In fact, I should point out at Norwich University, we graduated 200 plus in our class, and there was only, I think it was 4 or 5 of us that went in the Air Force. And so we were kind of viewed as traitors doing that. School that had nearly you know, at that time, probably 160 years of Army history, and here's these guys going off considering the Air Force. But I went down to Tyndall Air Force Base, and you know, they try to give you some ideas of what some options might be out there. And I was still hoping maybe I could be a pilot, because being going in the Air Force, that still, you know, made sense. I didn't know much about flying, but it kind of made sense. But this issue was hanging over me about my eyesight. And when I was down there, we went over to Eglin Air Force Base, and they had F-4 Phantoms. And of course, the F-4 Phantom was the main fighter of that time, you know, the workhorse during Vietnam, multi-role fighter. And it's a two crewed airplanes, right? So it's a pilot and a weapons systems officer in the back, and it was made aware to me that you didn't have to have 20/20 eyesight to fly in the back seat, and that would be a way to be involved with aviation without meeting the you know, the 20/20 eyesight. And while I was down there, they gave us a flight in a C-54, and then we got a flight in a helicopter. But I got to fly in the back of a T-33. And, you know, my whole life changed after that. I mean, you know, here I am. So I was probably, I don't know, 20 years old, 19, I was probably 20 years old. You know, hey, here's your parachute, here's your helmet, we're going to strap you in. Don't touch anything, don't say anything, you know. But it was just amazing. And we were a target for aircraft, F-102s and F-106s that were practicing intercepts. And I had my camera with me, and I took pictures of these 106s that would pull up beside us, or 102s that pull up beside us after the intercept run. And when I got back home, I got those pictures developed, and I must have bored everybody to tears. My aunts, my uncles. I mean, look at this. Here's this. I was in this airplane. I had a helmet on, this and that. And I was just jazzed up. So my mission became to get, you know, to graduate from Norwich, go into the Air Force, go to navigator school. And at that time, everybody that, regardless of what you were going to fly as a non-pilot, if you were going to be a rated officer, you went to navigator training. We did navigator training in T-29s, you know, propellers and sextants, and sort of learned to be sort of a World War II kind of navigator, which was kind of fun. But my goal was to go to the F4, and I can't remember how many were in my class, but they gave out assignments based on where you were in the stack there. You know, the number one guy might pick a an F4 or an F-111, and the number 2 person would pick this or that or whatever, and you worked your way down at the end, and the poor people at the end, nothing against the KC-135, love them, they do a great job, but that's where the navigators that were at the bottom of the class went. So fortunately, I graduated high enough, and I was able to get an F4 assignment, and then went to F4 RTU at Luke Air Force Base. And so what went from a kid growing up in Northeast Vermont that had never been anywhere, going to Air Force ROTC, going to summer camp, getting this little bit of taste of aviation and the excitement that goes with us, and giving me a vector, just opened up my whole world.
Wow. I have to say, growing up, the F4 was one of my favorite aircraft. When you looked at the models and things like that, there's just a small set of aircraft that were really, really something. And that thing, it's so big, it's so powerful. Tell me a little bit about the plane and what it was like when you got introduced to it.
Yeah, no, it was wonderful. We saw it when I was at ROTC summer camp. Just to back up, we went to Eglin. They had F4s there. I said that was the primary fighter, and we went out to the end of the runway at Mobile, where the the duty officer would be, and making sure people put their gear down and did all those kind of things. And we're out there at the end of the runway, and these airplanes would come out, a 4-ship, and they'd take off. And like you said, I mean, the noise and the it'd shake your insides. We're out there just off the end of the runway. So I was really looking forward to getting a chance to fly in the airplane. Now I show up at Luke Air Force Base with no flight experience, other than that one T-33 flight. I didn't have a pilot license or anything like that. So now I'm going through F4 RTU training, and so it was a whole new world for me. Learning to pull, learning to deal with G-forces. Of course, I show up there in the summer in Phoenix, Arizona. So it's we fly early, but it's still 90 degrees, at 9 o'clock in the morning or what have you. So it was pretty exciting, and I think I did pretty well at it. I loved it. I worked hard. I wasn't at the top of my class, but I was a long ways from the bottom. And it was pretty exciting. The training was 6 months there. You flew with mostly with instructor pilots, but then you would also fly with some of the student pilots, because eventually you're going to land up with a real operational unit, and you're going to be crewed with somebody, and you're going to have to fly as a crew. So it was very exciting. We had a little bit of air-to-air experience. We dropped the bombs, but it was mostly just getting used to the environment and getting used to what it would be like to work as a crew in an airplane.
Yeah, that's really something. There's a lot of people that have been on the show speak extraordinarily highly of WSOs and RSOs and what their experience, and how important that position is, and how they're the real judge of the pilots. They're the honest judge. What do they call it? The WSO Club or the WSO Mafia?
Yeah,
something.
Everybody kind of had a rating system for who you wanted to fly with or not fly with, what have you. But, I was very fortunate to start up my Air Force career doing that. I dealt with a little bit of air sickness at first. You're in the back getting thrown around a little bit. It's kind of hot, whatever. But you kind of work your way through that, and I think most people can. It wasn't terrible, but it was a little bit of a concern at first. I remember thinking, okay, am I going to feel like crap every time I get out of the airplane here, or am I going to be able to work my way through it? And eventually you do. Most people do.
Do backseaters also have the ability and the training to land the aircraft in the event of a pilot incapacitation?
To some extent. So that wasn't part of the training. That wasn't a requirement. There was no, okay, you got to be able to learn or land the airplane from the back if the pilot is incapacitated. But for the most part, when people got in operational units, they learned to fly, and they learned to fly well enough so that they could land the airplane in an emergency. And some people enjoyed that more. In fact, some of the guys in the back, some of my peers were probably not very good WSOs, but were very good backseat pilots, because that's all they wanted to do. Hey, can I have the stick? So they'd fly formation, they'd do whatever, they'd make the takeoff, they'd do whatever, because that's really what they wanted to do. But they didn't really do very well at what their real job was. So I tried to focus on my real job and be just as good as I could at that. But I did enjoy flying, and that gave me the bug to want to get my General Aviation FAA licenses, right? So I learned to fly to some extent from the backseat of the F4, and then on the side through the aero clubs, whatever, got my private license and commercial and CFI and all that sort of stuff.
Wow. So what makes a good WISO or RSO? What is it? What's involved in really being quite good at that? Because we always hear about the glory going to the pilot.
Yeah. No, I think rightfully so. The pilot is the aircraft commander, right? We all know as pilot what that means, and that's the ultimate responsibility. But to be a good WISO, you really are, obviously you're the number 2 person there, and you know when to speak up, you know when to say, hey, this isn't right, we need to be doing that. You know the systems in the airplane is good or better than the pilot. That maybe you don't know, maybe you don't have access to this knob in the back seat, but you know all about that system every bit as good as the pilot. If you think, well, we'll just let the pilot deal with that stuff, I don't need to worry about that, you're probably not being as good as you could, because as people become in two-place airplanes, two-place fighters, the WISOs, as they get more experience, will end up being crewed with the inexperienced pilots, right? And so, you've got a WISO maybe flying with a couple thousand hours in the back seat, flying with a pilot that's got 200 hours in the front seat, right? So the pilot and the WISO in the back can really be a huge help to the pilot, the lesser experienced pilot, if there's any sort of emergency, or helping to train that pilot. And I saw that, I had maybe we'll talk about it a little later if we have time, but I had an exchange tour with the Navy. And I saw quite a difference with the Navy RIOs, radar intercept officers, the gooses from Top Gun and the F-14, whatever, than what I saw in the Air Force. And one of the things I think that, and it wasn't that one was better than the other, but there was a difference. I got to experience both. And the F-4, the Navy F-4s did not have flight controls in the back. You could not fly the airplane from the back at all. And so right from the beginning, the RIOs had to know how to deal with the airplane without never having flown it, ever had their hands on the stick and throttle. And also that set up for the pilots a different situation than what I saw in the Air Force. So if you had a pilot in the F-4 that maybe was struggling or maybe going through initial training, need a little bit of extra help, they would take the WISO out and put an instructor pilot back there, right? Kind of makes sense. In the Navy community, I was an instructor in the Navy RTU on my third, my third assignment, the F4. They didn't do that, because the pilot said, that's not, there's no controls back there, what can I do? And the RIOs learned to be very, very good at instructing from the back seat. I mean, it was just amazing to me. I could hear these guys, I'd listen to their tapes as I was trying to get up to speed and, learn about, what was involved for the pilot landing in the aircraft carrier. And these guys that had never, ever flown the airplane could talk to the pilot and, right for lineup, nose up, little nose, power, okay. I mean, they knew what the picture looked like and knew exactly when to speak up, if there was going to be a problem, and how to coach that pilot through it. And that didn't exist in the Air Force situation, because if a pilot was struggling, they would put an IP with them, and there would be check rides and that sort of stuff. So while I'm sure the Navy guys probably said, oh, I wish we had flight controls back there, in some ways, maybe it was a little bit of, detriment to that career field. And I saw in the Navy, they also, things changed in the Air Force. When I was in the Air Force as a WISO, as a nav, there were less command opportunities of flying flying squadrons. They were very, very limited. That since has changed. But in the Navy, they always, when I got to the RTU squadron, and when I first was there, our skipper was a RIO, and his XO was a pilot, and the next day swapped around. I didn't see that in the Air Force. So there was, I think, a higher expectation for the Navy RIOs than I saw with the Air Force. As an example, when I was an instructor in F4s with the Navy, we washed RIOs out of RTU if they struggled, given appropriate help, whatever. I never saw that happen in the Air Force. It was always like, well, the guy's not going to kill anybody because, but there was a requirement for the RIOs to be really good, and the Navy put a premium on that, and they washed people out. And not that there was a huge difference, let's say, in in the quality between the two services, but it was interesting to experience both sides.
Wow. So tell me a little bit about your progression and what got you introduced to the SR-71 program.
Yeah, so I flew the F4. I went to, it was in a Wild Weasel squadron flying F4Cs in Okinawa, Japan. Then I went to the fighter weapons school at Nellis. You know, the Air Force is equivalent to Top Gun. Everybody knows it is Top Gun in the Navy, but the fighter weapons school at Nellis in the F4. And then I went back to the Pacific at Clark Air Force Base flying the F4Es. And then after that, I went to the Navy exchange tour. So I was there on that Navy exchange tour and thinking I'm going to continue flying airplanes as a, F4 WSO. I'm going to go back to the Air Force. I'm going to take back all these great lessons I learned from the Navy back to the Air Force. And, that's why we do those things, right? But because I had an engineering degree, for whatever reason, there was a shortage of engineers in the Air Force. And the Air Force could see that while the F4 was still the predominant fighter, thousands of them, a couple thousand of them in the Air Force, at some point they were going to be phased out and replaced by the F-16, single-seat F-16, single-seat F-15s, right? The F-15E was just an idea at that point. It hadn't really come along. So the personnel folks said, oh, you've got an engineering degree. We're going to make you an engineer. And I thought, what's this about? I didn't sign up for any of this. I mean, I have a degree in engineering, but I haven't done anything with it. And so my whole world got sort of turned upside down. And fortunately, the personnel folks were looking out for me and thought maybe I was getting the short end of the stick here. And I landed up being assigned to a special project where we were flight testing some of the newest airplanes going on, right? So I was an engineer. I got assigned to this organization. I was living in Las Vegas. I got to saw the F-117 fly at its first flight. There was a number of other classified programs that were going on at that time, some of which have been made public, some of which have not. And I showed up just at the right time there with no engineering experience, but I had this flight experience. And so my flying at that point became support flying. It became chase aircraft, photography, along for the ride, so to speak. But it was engineering where, mission control, being in the control room, writing test plans, analyzing data. And so I kind of had the best of both worlds. I was continuing to fly, and I had the opportunity to become very, very involved with some of these very important classified programs. The organizations were not manned very heavily. Everybody was working hard, long hours. We'd go to work on Monday, come home on Thursday or Friday, what have you. And it was pretty intense, and I really, really lucked out with that. And so while I was there, it became obvious to me that the way to progress in that career field was to go to the test pilot school. And I raised my hand, and some of the folks wrote letters of recommendation for me. I was able to get to the test pilot school. That was in 1983, so that was 10 years after I had come into the Air Force. So now I've got some, operational experience. I've got a little bit of engineering experience now for a couple of years, a year and a half or so, and I went to the test pilot school. So the test pilot school, sometimes just to explain just a little bit for folks, is made up of, the test pilot school class is made up of pilots, WSOs or navigators, and engineers, people that aren't rated officers, because the test community involves those professions that are doing flight tests. But if it's a single-seat airplane, the pilot flying the airplane, but there's engineers that are there in the control room, getting the pilot to move over to the next test point, looking at the data to make sure that the test point was properly flown, writing the test plans, debriefing the pilots, working as a team. So the test pilot school teaches that. And of course, being a WSO, you're looking for opportunities where you can fly, where you would actually do flight tests in a flying role, as opposed to just in a pure engineering role. So when I graduated from the test pilot school in December of '83, I went back to that same organization that I was at before, got involved with running a very interesting classified program where we were doing flight tests. And I was very fortunate to get involved very early on with things where the Air Force was focusing on, and the DoD was focusing on stealth technology, right? What does this mean? How much is good enough? How do you evaluate it? the designers can design something. You could maybe test it on the ground at a range with radars or what have you. But now when you're in the air, does it really perform? With flight controls moving around, with gaps and cracks from gear doors, and a pilot in the cockpit, does it really, does it have the right signature? How does it perform against, as close as you can get to real threats? And that's the part that I got involved with. And there was only 2 or 3 of us at the time that were involved with that. We didn't know what we were doing. Like most things, you just kind of, make it up as you go along, and we learned from each other, and it was an exciting time to actually be involved with that. And like I said, I saw the F-117 fly in its first flight, but my role was more in evaluating, does it have the right signature? How does it perform against threat systems? If we expected it, let's say a regular airplane would be detected at 50 miles by an airborne radar, and now we're predicting it's going to be detected at 5 miles, let's say, which is a big difference. You have to go out and test that, make sure it's not being detected at 25 miles or 20 miles. And how well does it match your model, your prediction, like anything in flight test. So I went back doing that stuff, and then an opportunity came up there was a position down at Palmdale, California, working at Air Force Plant 42. It's a government facility that was pretty much run by Lockheed, where they did overhaul on the SR-71, program depot work, PDM it was called, where they stripped the airplanes all down, put them all back together, and then somebody has to fly them to make sure everything's working right. And then we also had a test airplane. It was tail number 972, which that's the one we have at Udvar-Hazy out at the museum. We talk about that later. But we had a test airplane that was instrumented, and we tested new radars. We tested electronic warfare equipment, new jamming equipment. Oh, there. So new jamming equipment. That's tail number 972 out at Palmdale Air Force Plant 42. And it was an exciting time. So now I'm working not just as an engineer on a very neat program, and the SR had been around for a while. So the airplane first flew in 1964, and now we're talking 1985, somewhere around that time frame. So it's been around for a while, but the airplane, like any airplane, is not just the airplanes coming out of the depot that had to be tested before we delivered them up at Beale to the operational unit, but they were developing a new advanced synthetic aperture radar so that you could get imagery and collect intelligence information through the weather or at night, not just cameras. And then we had, while there weren't a lot of threats that the SR-71 had to worry about, there were a few surface-to-air missile systems. So we had new jamming equipment we were testing. And then the airplane was also, we had gone from an analog flight control system, and the SR-71, that's after my first flight in the SR-71, that one. And so, there was an analog flight control system that was the stability augmentation system for the airplane. It controlled the inlets, which was very important. It was the autopilot for the airplane, and we went from an analog system to a digital system. So that was something we were testing as well. So it was pretty exciting. We had our own test aircraft. We had our own T-38 also. And I should point out there was only 4 of us. There was 4 crew members, 2 pilots and 2 RSOs. And 2 of the pilots, 1 pilot, 1 RSO came from the operational community. They had, extensive experience flying the airplane operational. And then 1 pilot, 1 RSO, that was me, came from the flight test community. We had been to the test pilot school. We had engineering degrees. We, had been trained in the principles of flight test and what was involved with that. So it was a wonderful time to learn about how the airplane was being employed. I did make a trip over to Mildenhall, England, which was one of the places that the airplane was being operated out of, and got to experience what they did over there. I was trained by in the same way that all the other crew members were trained up at Beale in the simulator and doing all those kind of things. So, thought I died and gone to heaven. So, here's this kid from Vermont that had never flown on an airplane, 20 years old, goes to Florida and says, wow, this is kind of cool. And now all of a sudden I'm flying the SR-71. And I flew the airplane for about 2.5 years. I don't have a whole career doing it, but I was very fortunate to do it. In the flight test we were doing, the airplane was designed to go very high and very fast. And we pretty much did that on every single mission. It went, 3.2, and we did that on every mission, almost every mission. And it went to 80 to 85,000 feet. We did that on every mission. because the
Wow.
things we were testing had to be tested at essentially the limits of the airplane.
Yeah. Mach 3.2 and what did you say, 82,000 or 85,000?
85,000 is the surface ceiling. So, we start a cruise climb in the, low to mid 70s, and as you burn off fuel, you get up into the maybe 85,000 feet, depending on the mission profile you're flying.
Wow. Tell me a little bit about, especially since we're focused on stealth technology. You mentioned the F-117, and Thad Dagger's been on the show, who also Dagger, who was a pilot of that, and an amazing human being. And there's such different planes. When you look at it, I'm just talking about the design, just the idea that one is completely faceted and another is very smooth in its curves. And when we think of things like the B2 or the B1, they're also very smooth. What's the concepts that are so radically different?
So the F-117 became the first operational stealth aircraft, right? Stealth fighter, the first one. And before that, there was a program called Have Blue, which was the predecessor to the F-117. There was 2 of those aircraft built. They were tested. Think of it as a concept design. The folks at the Lockheed Skunkworks came up with an idea. And back then, the computational capability to predict the signature, the capability computationally, computer-wise, wasn't there to have the fidelity that was necessary to do something that was smooth and curved like that. But doing flat plates mathematically was easier to model and predict. And I mentioned, we were talking the other day, Dennis Oberholzer, a good friend of mine, was at Lockheed at that time, and he is the designer of the F-117 from a signature standpoint. Obviously, Ben Rich was heavily involved, what have you, but when it comes to the signature, it's a gentleman named Dennis Oberholzer who had the insight to pick up on some work that was done by the Soviet scientist Peter Yefremov. I can never pronounce his name properly, but Peter Yefremov had written a paper about how you calculate the radar cross-section of faceted objects. And that paper that Dennis understood was then turned into something that became Have Blue, and then became the F-117. But now the computational capability and the understanding of the technology, allowed us to get to the B2, and now what you see with the F-22 and the F-35, the technology is advanced enough that we really can make an airplane that doesn't have to have the trade-offs that the F-117 did. The F-117 was, how do we make it stealthy, and then everything else we'll figure out as best we can to make it work. Whereas the F-22 and the F-35 are, phenomenal aircraft in their own right. And oh, by the way, they're very, very, very capable from a stealth technology standpoint. But we couldn't do that starting out.
When we had a very unique opportunity to be up close with the 35, and it is shocking to me the gaps, how tight that airplane is, that when you go to the slats and the control surfaces, you can barely tell where they move. It's really, really impressive.
Yeah, and when you think about it, when radar energy hits a surface, as I do with my hands here, and as it travels over the surface, if it hits a gap or a crack, that will radiate just like an antenna. I mean, just by itself, that gap or crack. So you need to have it so that it travels over in such a way that it'll dissipate, and there's techniques that are used to dissipate the energy when it gets to the trailing edge, depending on the frequency and the polarization and these kind of things. It's just fascinating stuff. But I was very fortunate to be there, not at day one, not when Have Blue was flying. Both those airplanes were lost in accidents. But I was there at the beginning of the F-117, and then later in my career, I was in the Pentagon when the F-117 was employed at Baghdad, and I knew exactly how the airplane would perform. Now, those that were sitting in the airplane flying into downtown Baghdad that night were probably hoping it was going to perform like they had been told. And we had developed mission planning books and the data to properly plan the missions. We had been up to the operational units and trained them in the early years about here's what this thing is and here's what it isn't, right? Mm-hmm. When the people think these are invisible airplanes, that's not the case. Anything will be detected at some point. The question is, can somebody do something about it in a timely manner to affect the kill?
So the SR-71, while it's swooping lines and kind of like smooth, it really, even though it looks a lot like something like, let's say, a B-1 in a way, or the kind of these lines. So it sounds like that was more about its design for a, being able to fly at that altitude, being able to do the performance that it did.
Yeah, that
As
was the primary driver. But if you look at the history, and I've talked to some folks at Lockheed about this, and you can find some reports out there that there were pretty significant attempts to reduce the radar cross-section of the SR-71. And if you look at the leading edges of the wing, there's these pie plate shapes in there that were set up such that radar would enter and then bounce around inside, the leading edge. They were transparent to radar. It would bounce around inside there, and then by the time it came out, it would be dissipated some. If you look at the way the tails are canted also, for aerodynamic reasons that made sense, but they were canted also for it helped with the radar energy being detected. There was radar absorptive material on the aircraft also, and there was a pole model built, that people may or may not be aware of, but before the SR-71, there was an aircraft, the A-12, which flew 2 years before the SR-71. It was operated by the CIA. There was only a handful of operational missions flown. It was a single-seat aircraft, only had cameras, but there was I use the term pole model, which is a non-flyable aircraft that is representative of the cross-section that was built, of the radar cross-section was built and measured. So they were working on what the how to reduce the signature of the aircraft. And I know from testing that we did while I was at Palmdale, the radar cross-section of the SR-71 is that of a small fighter, even though it is a big-looking airplane. So think of a cross-section like a T-38 or a small fighter, like a small trainer aircraft like that. This large aircraft has that kind of signature at certain frequencies.
Yeah. What's this really small aircraft doing over Mach 3 at 85,000 feet?
Yeah, it was a little bit of electronic warfare, and that's what made it all work. So the primary driver for survivability was speed and altitude, reduce the radar cross-section so they have a little bit less time to deal with it, maybe only 10% less, 20% less, whatever, and then throw in some electronic warfare where you're not quite going to be invincible, and it made for a extremely survivable aircraft. All those things together, just amazing.
So tell me a little bit, there's the things that people think about, I think, or kind of most commonly told about the airplane have to do with the heat dissipation, how it grows in flight, fuel leaking and special fuel because of all that stuff of how this plane has to change in flight. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the average surface temperature of the airplane is 600 degrees. The average, there's certain parts that's the skin of the airplane. There's some parts that are like 1100 degrees that are back there by the afterburner. And I should point out this airplane obviously takes off an afterburner, and after coming off the tanker, it climbs an afterburner and it cruises an afterburner for like an hour at a time. So it's operating the afterburner, not just to go for some dash speed, but for operating and for cruising. And so with a 600-degree surface temperature, even though it's like minus 67 degrees outside, it's quite cold at those altitudes, the surface temperature is hot. So over 90% of the airplane is made out of titanium. Titanium is, it can handle the heat and retain its strength, whereas aluminum skin wouldn't going to be able to do that. A lot of the structure is titanium as well. They used fuel for cooling the airplane, so they came up with a special fuel. The SR-71 was the only airplane that used that fuel. It had a very high flash point. Using standard jet fuel like other aircraft use wasn't going to work because of the high elevated temperatures, so they had a special fuel for that. It was kind of interesting. That fuel had such a high flash point, you couldn't ignite it with a standard igniter like you have in a jet engine. A jet engine starts by getting it motored over by a motor or air or what have you, and then putting fuel to it, and then with an igniter plug, igniting the fuel, and then it's self-sustaining as long as you keep the fuel to it and air. But you couldn't ignite the fuel with an igniter plug, so it used a special chemical called TEB, triethylborane. I think the pilot had 14 shots at TEB for each engine You would have to use it for engine start. You'd have to use it for igniting lighting the afterburner, or if you had a flame out. And TEB was a very dangerous chemical. It ignited on contact with air. And so it was in a tank way in the back. The fuel was just as safe as could be, but the TEB was not. And when they came to fuel the airplane, nobody, I wouldn't say they didn't sweat it, but it was a pretty nonchalant kind of thing. But when they came to fuel the TEB tank, they had the hazmat stuff on, the fire truck standing by, because if there was a leak, that stuff ignited with air. And when you started the engine, when the pilot gave it a shot of TEB, give it fuel or a shot of TEB, there was this boom. You could feel it in the engine. And there's pictures, you can see a flame coming out of the back when the thing lit off. So all these inventions had to go into designing the airplane, and dealing with the heat and the temperature was a biggie. And by having fuel that had a high flash point, they could use the fuel to cool certain avionics bays or certain components in the aircraft. Just like you use water in your radiator to cool your engine, you could use fuel. And you could get the fuel to an elevated temperature, send it to the engine, burn it, and out it goes. Pretty slick when you think about it.
Yeah, that's pretty wild to route the fuel.
Numerous inventions that they had to come up with for the airplane. It's just remarkable what they did.
And so is it true that it was kind of leaky before when it was cold?
Yeah, when it's on the ground, the airplane leaked fuel. Yes, and so you've got. So when the airplanes came in for overhaul, one of the things they would do is they had a couple of small statured individuals who would crawl into these fuel tanks. In fact, the whole fuselage, about, I don't know, 3 feet or so aft of the RSO cockpit, after what's called the astro navigation system, all the way back behind there is fuel. And then inside the wings. And so the fuel tanks would be scraped out, the sealant would be cleaned out, because what happened is the airplane got hot and then cooled down, got hot and cooled down. It was just like that caulking material in your bathroom that never seems to last the 10 years on the tube or whatever that it says it's gonna, and the airplane would leak fuel. When they came out of overhaul, they were pretty tight. There'd be a little bit of leak sometimes, but after several months of operation with that cycling of heat, whatever, the airplane would leak fuel. And I don't just mean a drop or two. I mean, there'd be puddles of fuel underneath the airplane. And there was in the manual, there was so many drips per minute, a certain flow rate that was tolerable. If it didn't meet that, they had to do something to go in and fix it. But yeah.
Wow, that's pretty wild. Talk to me a little bit about.
My parents came out when I was at Palmdale, and it was always fun to have a family member or guest come out and watch the airplane, right? So you suit up and you go out, you get in the airplane, and it takes off and makes a lot of noise and big afterburner. You have your friends or family stand at the end of the runway, and it's pretty exciting. I always enjoy doing it, but I forgot to tell my mother that there's going to be this fuel on the ground. It's going to smell like kerosene, and she was quite concerned. When you get out there, there's all this fuel and you can smell it. And does anybody know this thing is leaking or whatever? So I should have told her that. It's normal, Mom. Don't worry about
it. Tell me a little bit about the forward and the cockpit, both in front and also for the RSO. This looks mind-boggling.
Yeah, up front there's a lot of things that you don't. Now it's an old airplane, so that's why it's round dials and it's kind of remarkable. There was very little done to change the cockpit from the initial design of the airplane. There was a laser artificial horizon that was put in, and actually we flight tested at Palmdale that went out to the fleet. But it's round dials like you see there. So there are at this scale, it's a little too hard for me to point out various things. But a lot of what the extra dials and knobs, etc., are for controlling the inlet. So the inlet moves back 26 inches as a function of Mach number. I think it starts at Mach 1.5, if I recall right. I may have that wrong. And it starts moving back 26 inches such that at Mach 3 or 3.2, it's all the way back. And what that does is that sets up a series of shock waves. There's one that comes right off the tip of the inlet, and then it just touches the outside of the inlet. It comes right off the tip of the cone, I should say, and then just touches the outside of the inlet, and it's called an oblique shock wave. And then there's another series of oblique shock waves inside the inlet, and then there's finally something called a normal shock wave. And what those shock waves do is they slow down the air and they compress it. Because a jet engine can't take supersonic air, it has to be slowed down, it has to be compressed. And so those gauges over on the right side are for spike positioning. There's forward bypass doors and there's aft bypass doors that are, for the most part, all controlled automatically by what was initially an analog computer and later was changed to a digital computer. And you've probably heard people talk about unstarts, and that's when that shock wave gets spit out. And now you're trying to cram supersonic air into the inlet. The engine doesn't like it. You get this asymmetrical thrust. Engines are further out. You've had an unstart on one side. First of all, you get this big bang. I mean, it really is frightening, just like somebody took a sledgehammer beside the cockpit. And then you've got this asymmetric thrust. It yaws the airplane, the nose pitches up, and if the airplane isn't handled properly, you could have loss of control. And during the early days, there were airplanes that were lost due to these unstarts. But with the digital system, it did very, very well, and the pilot can actually control that manually. If there's can control the position of the spike and the forward bypass doors and the aft bypass doors if that's needed. So that's why, even you can control EGT for the engine. When you have a fighter, they would take the engine to the engine test stand and they would tune it up, so to speak, and adjust the exhaust gas temperature. The pilot had the opportunity to tune that inside the airplane during flight. So there was a lot of controls that you wouldn't have in a normal airplane that wasn't operating in these kind of conditions. So the pilot had his hands full, mostly monitoring these things. But if things weren't working right, then he needed to take over and control it himself.
Wow. Now, obviously, when you're going over Mach 3, there's a lot happening. I assume RSO is doing all the navigation and all the surveillance.
Yes. So the airplane can't be flown single seat. I mean, I guess technically it could subsonic if you need to go from here to there, but the navigation system is in the back. So the RSO in the back does the talking on the radios, controls the navigation system, which was a remarkable system. The Astro navigation system, it was a inertial navigation system. People are probably familiar with an inertial navigation system, but it's a box that has gyros in it on all three axes. So think of spinning wheels. And so that allows the platform to remain rigid. So if the airplane banks or pitches up or yaws or whatever, the box knows up and down, it's keeping the box rigid. So you tell it where it is in latitude and longitude, and then it has sensors on it, accelerometers that measure the acceleration. It does something called integration, works it backwards to get velocity and then gets position. And so if you tell it where it is and then it senses how you've moved, it knows where you are. But inertial navigation system drifts with time. So the SR-71 navigation system was called an Astro navigation system, an ANS. It was made by Northrop. This is before they were Northrop Grumman, but it's made by Northrop, I think out of Chicago. But anyway, it had behind the RSO cockpit is where the navigation system is, and there's a glass window behind the cockpit, and there's a telescope that looks through that glass window, and that telescope tracks the stars. And it does just like a mariner would do at sea with a sextant, getting a line of position off a star, another star, another star. Where those lines cross is where you are, and that's what bounds the errors on the inertial navigation system so that it doesn't drift, because inertial navigation system that is not updated or not bounded will drift maybe during this time frame, maybe 3 miles an hour. So, after an hour, you're 3 miles off. That wasn't going to be good enough for the sensors to come on and off at the right spot. And what was remarkable is this Astro navigation system would track the stars even in the day.
Wow.
So they're out there during the day. You can't see them, but the system could sense them and see them.
Wow, that's impressive. And then how do you communicate to the pilot where to go?
So just like any other airplane, the pilot has steering bars and, needles up front, just like you would, picture that if you had a GPS system with the G1000 or whatever, and the pilot maybe didn't have access to it, but all he's got is a bearing pointer, needles, whatever, and a DME countdown, what have you. So all of that is, so the training was such that you would count down to the waypoints. You had a turn radius that was, it was like a 30-mile turn radius. It took like 70 miles to get turned all around. I mean, there was no 90-degree bank turns. There was no high G turns. I think that normally the turns were planned at, I want to say 32 degrees. In some cases, it could be a little bit higher. The limits are about 45 degrees of bank at Mach number. So it was, to the pilot, it was pretty easy. He just had a set of commands. He's flying the commands. The RSO would count down where you're going. We also had a backup inertial navigation system, another INS back there that wasn't an Astro system. Of course, in the States, you had TACAN and all those kind of things for, normal communications via radios. We had something called a video view site also that was kind of interesting. We tested at Palmdale and went out to the fleet, but it was actually a camera to look down through the bottom of the airplane, a digital camera, electro-optical camera, and you could update the inertial navigation system off of that. So on your planned mission, there would be maybe a bridge that crossed a river, and you could update off of that, and it would make sure that the inertial navigation system and the Astro navigation system was advertised, I think, to have 330 feet of accuracy, which today doesn't sound like very good in today's GPS world, but back then that was pretty good. And the system generally did better than that, but that was kind of the limit on, as I recall, 330 feet.
Wow. Any exciting moments or during any of your flights with it?
Yeah, I didn't fly the airplane operationally. I didn't have to deport it. I wasn't flying along, I knew guys that were flying along the Barents up there, in the Arctic region that had to divert into Bodo, Norway, and places like that would have been pretty exciting. But we had our share of emergencies and unstarts because we were, testing the airplanes, the ones that were coming out of overhaul. Maybe something wasn't quite right with whatever. So, we had our share of generators falling off the line, or engines over temping, or things like that you had to deal with. But nothing that I did have one flight. It was, I wouldn't call it exciting, but it was kind of interesting. We had to go to Mildenhall to pick up an airplane and bring it back to Palmdale. It had unfortunately been over G'd. The pilot had, it was actually, they were doing a small air show, some flybys, whatever, as part of a authorized air show, and pilot landed up over G'ing the airplane. He wrote it up, and I can't remember what the limit was, subsonic, maybe 4 Gs, 4.5. It wasn't anything outstanding, but it got written up, and they did the inspection. They didn't see anything wrong with it. And when they came to refuel the airplane, it wasn't just a little bit of fuel that was leaking out, it was just gushing out. And there had been some major structural components that had been broken in the airplane. So they got the Lockheed team over there to figure out what to do with it and how to get it fixed. They decided they couldn't fix it over there in England, at Mildenhall, England. They had to bring it back to Palmdale, and we got a one-time permit to bring the airplane back. And they put some, I don't know, I'm not sure it was, they didn't pop rivet in some braces or something, but they did something to try to strengthen up, or they thought it was going to be a problem, and they did some analysis. But I remember in the debrief, they said, and they limited the airplane to Mach 2.8. Because as things get hotter, of course, structure isn't going to be as strong. The material's not going to be as strong. So we were limited to Mach 2.8, flying it back from Mildenhall to Palmdale, California. And in the briefing, they said, okay, this should be just fine. But the area we're less certain of is, as you're going down the runway, when the nose comes up, just as you start to rotate, that's the highest stress on the airplane for this whole flight profile. And if there's a problem, that's when it's going to break in half.
Oh, God.
200, at 200 miles an hour, as the nose is coming up, that's where the problem is going to be. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And so I will say that it was pretty quiet as we were rolling down the runway. We both were, paying particular attention to anything that seemed abnormal, but it was all just fine, and the engineers had done their work. But it was nice they told us that, at least, that was where the problem was going to occur, if there was going to be a problem. If there was no problem then, you're good. It was going to be no problem at all.
Just so you know, if the airplane's going to break in half, here's where it's going to happen.
If you get through that, you're okay. And that airplane never flew again. That airplane never flew again. They brought it back, and it was going to be too much work to repair it. So we had the last flight of that airplane. I can't recall the tail number. I have it in my notes somewhere.
So let's talk a little bit about the museums. This is the plane that you've been in.
Yeah. So I'm very fortunate to work as a volunteer at the Air and Space Museum. So I live in Northern Virginia. I've retired from the military. I started an engineering services firm. I've enjoyed doing that. I'm still involved with the company as the chairman of the board. The company's doing well, and they don't need me there every day. So I get to spend time doing what I want to do. And one of the things that I really enjoy is volunteering at the Air and Space Museum as a docent there. And they have a wonderful, I guess I've been doing it for about 12 years now. It was something as I was getting ready towards retirement, trying to find out what I would spend my time on. And the Air and Space Museum is just a wonderful museum. The training was just fabulous. And we had, the training was to be a docent there. And the docent corps is not just people that flew a particular airplane there or were in the military. We have retired airline pilots, we have retired teachers, we have people that love history. We have just a whole range of just wonderful people, but the common thing is they all love aviation, and they love sharing what they know about aviation, and they love continually learning more about aviation. And so the training that we all went through, it was 6 months of every other Saturday. So I think that worked out to be 12 Saturdays, 12 or 13 Saturdays all day. And so, you start out, I was a pilot, a general aviation pilot, so I knew some things about pilot. I've been in the military as a WSO, RSO, flown some interesting airplanes. But you realize that there's a lot of things about aviation you don't know anything about. Lighter than air, hot air balloons, right? Dirigibles, blimps, sailplanes, right? It goes on and on and on. Air and Space Museum, right? Spacecraft, early space flight. And so the training was wonderful, and we continue to have monthly training. And I was out there today in Udvar-Hazy, and so I should point out the Air and Space Museum, for those that aren't familiar, is in Washington, D.C., part of the Smithsonian system. It's one museum with 2 locations. Need a little water, excuse me. There's the one down on the National Mall that was in the previous picture there. That's undergoing renovation, that one there. In fact, it looks quite a bit different today than that picture there because they have done some resurfacing on the outside. About half the museum is currently closed. The other half that is open has been totally revitalized, and it opened in November, and it is just spectacular. So the Wright brothers airplane, the Wright Flyers there, the gallery on early aviation, has the 1909 Wright Flyer in it. And I'll point out that there's a lot of wonderful aviation museums in the United States or in the world. But what makes the Smithsonian really special is we have some of the only, or the record setters, or one of a kind, and it just makes it a special place. And so, having the Wright Flyer down there and telling the story about the Wright brothers and what they did. In downtown, we have at the National Mall building. Before I talk about Udvar-Hazy, where I spend most of my volunteer time, for general aviation pilots, they opened a new gallery this fall called We All Fly, and it is exclusively focused on general aviation. We have Alan Klappmeyer's SR-72 in there, and it tells the story about the transformation that Cirrus made to composite airplanes, glass cockpits. We've all seen that, or we've lived it, or we're aware of it. But down at the Air and Space Museum, there's a place to tell that story. We have Sean D. Tucker's aerobatic airplane on display there. We have an airplane that was certified, I believe in the 50s, could have that date wrong, to both fly and be a car, the only certificated
the Aero car. Yep.
air. And so it's an amphibian, right? And
Yep.
so it's just some very interesting things down there. But out at Udvar-Hazy, that's the other location. That's out there at Dulles Airport. If you're a General Aviation pilot, you could fly right in there into Dulles. It's not too expensive if you're not flying a jet airplane or a turboprop. And even a turboprop's not too bad, but the landing fees and the FBO fees are not too bad. And the Udvar-Hazy Center is right there at the airport, at Dulles Airport. You'll need to take an Uber or get the FBO, give you a ride on over. There's actually a bus that goes between the main terminal and the museum. But it opened in 2003, and we have I think a couple hundred aircraft there, and it's another fascinating place as well. And we have some very unique and very one-of-a-kind airplanes, and it's just a great time to volunteer and spend time out there, and you meet some fabulous people that some of the favorite people I enjoy talking to, and I've had a couple that say, it's usually a wife or a girlfriend that says, my boyfriend or husband drags me to these places, and I put up with it, but I come here because he likes doing it. And so they become my goal. They become my goal to make this place interesting for them. And once in a while, I'm successful, and they will say, wow, I didn't really understand what this was all about. And so it's fun to run into those people as well. So it's a great place. And so I encourage people, if they have the chance to volunteer at any museum, especially an aviation museum, even if you're not an expert, you can learn what you need to learn. It's just a great time, and I've got a tremendous group of friends with my docent friends that we connect. We all love aviation.
And I will say, as someone who has flown down there and gone to Udvar-Hazy, it is not hard to fly into Dulles. To be able to do that, you of course have to go through the online course, so that you're able to fly in the outer part of the restricted zone. But it's so great to be able to land there at the FBO and hop over and go see the museum. And I'll add to people, if Washington is an area that is you're interested in being able to go and get certified by the Secret Service to go and fly to the GA airports that are within the free zone. You can combine all of it into one. You can fly into Dulles, you can go to Udvar-Hazy, you can visit the FSDO that you have to visit there in order to get your paperwork started, and that's that. We combined everything in trips in order to go down there and get our codes so that we can come and visit it. And I am looking forward to coming and seeing you, my friend, down there at some point again in the future and getting a personal tour of Udvar-Hazy.
We'll do that.
Absolutely. Well, Phil, thank you so much for taking time this evening to share your story, talk about the SR-71, the F4, and so many other things. You really continue to lead a spectacular life with some wonderful stories, and I look forward to having you back on the show sometime in the future.
All right, great. Hey, have a good evening, Jeff.
Absolutely. Thanks, Phil.
All right, bye.
And to all of you, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to join us here on SocialFlight Live. We'll be back next Tuesday, September 19th, with Jason Shepard of M0A. If you have watched him on YouTube or taken some of his courses there at M0A, you know that he is a very, very exciting and inspirational teacher. And he will be here talking about new techniques and things that he's doing as part of all of his work over at M0A. And then on Tuesday, September 26th, Army Black Hawk helicopter pilots Chris Reeves and Cole Hamilton will be here. If you were at AirVenture and you saw the Black Hawk demo that happened during the air show, these are the guys that were involved in that. Very, very cool stuff. And they'll tell you what's behind flying the Black Hawk and also flying these air shows, which I'll tell you from the information that they've shared with me is literally choreographed down to the second. It is amazing. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Until next time, Thank you so much for everything that you do to support General Aviation, for helping us here at SocialFlight do the same. And I wish you all blue skies.